It all follows a similar ultimatum from President Trump for Hamas to free the Israeli hostages. Joining me now is Laura Blumenfeld, former senior advisor to the US State Department's Israel-Palestine negotiating team. Thank you very much for being with us. And maybe, first of all, we just talk about this ultimatum from Benjamin Netanyahu. If Hamas does not return our hostages by noon on Saturday, the ceasefire will end and the fighting will then go on, he says, until Hamas is finally defeated. What do you make of this?
Well, Trump is a bit of a bull in a ceasefire china shop, and he's been, sort of disrupting. He's the disruptor, and he's just been disrupting all the negotiations. Perhaps Hamas has responded by saying threats have no value. So they're not listening to what Trump is saying, but they do understand that the dog Netanyahu, there's some bite to his bark. So I have a feeling, if I were a betting person, and no one wants to bet, of course, on the lives of these sensitive hostages, that we will see those hostages released on Saturday. There's a little bit of wiggle room. Trump has asked for all the hostages, and Netanyahu, when he said, I want my hostages, I believe it'll be those 3 hostages that were promised and will be delivered.
Right. I mean, we're still getting these remarks that are being made by Donald Trump at the White House, and he's said all bets are off if those hostages, or the hostages, as he says, are not returned. I mean, Donald Trump prides himself on being a deal maker. Can his style of deal making work on the Middle East, do you think?
Well, I think the question we all have to ask ourselves, is this a starting point or is he serious? If he's serious, he's accomplished what many U.S. presidents have tried to do, which is unite the Middle East. Unfortunately, this would be uniting all the Arab leaders against America. I think you really have to listen to his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, who said on television last Sunday, if you don't like Trump's proposal, come up with your own proposal. And already we've seen some action. Cairo announced that they're going to hold a summit on February 28th, perhaps to come up with their own, proposal for Gaza for the day after, security, governance. So I think there's an opportunity also with President Trump's meeting today with King Abdullah. The meeting today with King Abdullah is all about respect. And you saw President Trump usher him through the front door of the White House and say, this is a great man.
Yes. Donald Trump is now saying in the White House he thinks that there will be parcels of land in Jordan and in Egypt where Palestinians will live. That's what is the latest that he's been saying. I mean, it's a very difficult it's a huge meeting for King Abdullah, but a very difficult one.
Well, it's king to king. I think they both see themselves as smart, tough survivors. You have the Hashemite king who's meeting the imperial president. But remember, the Hashemites have survived, first of all, by maintaining a low kind of presence, a low key, and also by making themselves indispensable to the United States. I was at the White House in 1994 when King Abdullah's father, King Hussein, was visiting President Clinton. And at the end of the meeting, President Clinton stood up to show him to the exit. And King Hussein said, I know my way. They've been here and they know how to make themselves important to the United States. There are military bases there. They provide stability for Israel, which, President Trump has said is one of his key priorities. So I don't think Trump is going to be quite as quick to dismiss King Hussein today.
I mean, King Abdullah is making the point in these remarks that it would have to be a plan that suits everyone, and also says we should wait for the Egyptian plan, so suggesting, as you were a little earlier, that there may be something in the offing from Egypt.
That's right. There's a united Arab front. And we've seen from the very beginning of the crisis on October 7th, the moderate Arab states have been the swing voters, so to speak, the swing states in the Middle East. And they're the ones who are going to determine a positive outcome. So absolutely, there's going to be a united front of Arab states with King Abdullah as the first person, but he's part of a whole parade of Arab leaders who are going to be making their way to the White House and making their case. I believe they will be successful. Look, he can't say yes to this proposal. Of course, he can't say outright no to Donald Trump, but I think we're going to come up with a no but from King Abdullah, and a yes but from King Trump. I'm saying, you see how we're all falling into that, from President Trump. And I think there is a path forward. He's a disruptor. He's just blowing it all up. But when the pieces come down, it's got to be better because, look, the Israelis have been trying to get their hostages. They can't find them. They can't get them by military means. How do you find a needle in a haystack? They've burned down the haystack. There isn't much more to do now.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. I mean, these are the pictures that we're seeing of King Abdullah arriving at the White House in the last half hour or so. Trump is being asked inside the White House, what authority would the US, under what authority would the US take Gaza? And he says simply under US authority. I mean, this is typical Trump, isn't it?
It is typical Trump. And, I would refer the Middle East leaders to Canada, to Mexico. He starts out with a kind of preposterous idea, and then you kind of whittle them down to a policy. Unfortunately, they tend to be performative concessions, and that's not good for American leverage in the Middle East. Again, this is all about respect. Folks didn't necessarily respect President Biden. They perceived him as weak, but it isn't better to have a president who's considered wacky, right? I mean, perhaps wily is what Benjamin Netanyahu is hoping, that he's clever. But again, I would caution Netanyahu for getting, too tightly bound, drunk on Trump, because the hangover is going to be horrible. And he's going to be associated with positions that are so far to the right of what he himself had ever stood for. It's going to be very hard for him to climb back down from that.
And if, as you say, you think Hamas will release hostages at the weekend, more broadly, there's got to be a second phase of negotiations, which, as far as I'm aware, are not really underway yet. Can those second phase of negotiations happen against the backdrop of this Donald Trump plan for Gaza, do you think?
I think so. Again, going back to Trump first principles, which is America first. And for him, it's Americans first. So there are at least 2 Americans who are alive who are being held by Hamas. So he's a man who's very sensitive to images, to the visuals. And I think part of what triggered him this week was those images, those haunting images of the starved and tortured 3 Israeli hostages who were released last weekend. I think there's an impatience that's crawled into these negotiations. Being impatient in a deal is really kind of dangerous because it causes you to overreact and overreach. So I think if we can just kind of dial back the emotions and get back to cool-headed deal making, we will get there.
And to what extent is King Abdullah in these talks that are about to take place at the White House, to what extent is he under pressure because of the aid that the United States give his country, because of the security agreements that they have?
Well, yes, the aid is essential. It's over $1.5 billion a year. On the other hand, taking Palestinians in at this point is existential. And there's nothing that quite clarifies the mind than a gun to your head. And he does have a gun to his head, from both sides. So I do think he's under a lot of pressure. He comes from a line of survivors. He's named for King Abdullah. His grandfather was assassinated by a Palestinian in 1951. He was shot in Jerusalem by a Palestinian who wanted his own independent state. His father, King Hussein, survived 1970, Black September, when Palestinians rose up and tried to take over the government in Jordan. So, this is, again, he has the qualities that Donald Trump respects. The men can see each other, although he's a good foot or so shorter than President Trump. I do think that they'll see eye to eye and come out with some kind of compromise. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is saying, I'm sorry I keep repeating they're just remarks that we're getting, but they're quite interesting. I mean, he's saying now we do contribute a lot of money to Egypt and to Jordan, but then he says we're above making threats. But, I mean, this will, be something that the king will have to think about. I just wonder, finally, Laura, where do you think this is all heading? You seem to think that it's quite possible that some kind of agreement could come about at the end of all this.
Yes, I mean, those comments you're just quoting back to me, it sounds like Marlon Brando or, mafia, nice little country you got there. I'd hate to see anything to happen to it. And the concerns are real. Assad, the president of Syria, just fell. And so there's always the concern that there'll be some kind of internal domestic unrest and that King Abdullah would be deposed. But I do think that look, we're going to have to take it one day at a time here. In Arabic, it's shwai shwai, one step at a time, slowly, slowly. Let's get the hostages out. That's kind of the key to unlocking the region, whether it's a political horizon for a Palestinian state. That's what President Biden was pushing for, or something else. But we're never going to get beyond the bloodshed until those hostages are out. It will take the heat out of the battle for Israelis. There'll be no more pretext or excuse for continuing the fighting. President Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He's got his eyes on the prize, and those are Nobels and oil wells. It's beyond the battlefields of Gaza.